Hello and welcome again to this episode of Dogs or Torches. Today we are joined together again with Dr. Domenic D'Ettore to discuss the medieval debates centered around the use of analogical predication in syllogistic demonstration. In particular, in this episode, we discuss the 15th century theologian John Capreolus and his later interlocutors Dominic of Flanders and Paul Soncinas, and their contributions to the debate on analogy and demonstration. So, Dr. D'Ettore, I figured now we could maybe shift from the primitive Thomists and jump into the late 14th and early 15th century with the thought of John Capreolus. Could you give a sort of brief background of who Capreolus is and sort of his sort of significant accomplishments in Thomism and the tradition of medieval philosophy?
Okay. Well, we know the work of Capreolus through his massive defensiones of the theology of Thomas Aquinas. Now, this particular work is modeled off of Aquinas's commentary on the sentences of Peter Lombard. He tells you that his project is to answer the questions as much as possible through the words of Aquinas himself. So it has an extensive quantity of quotations of the works of Aquinas from, he's got a wide range of the works of Aquinas that he had access to and that he's able to bring to bear on the set of questions. At the same time as he is engaging the thought of Aquinas on these questions, he's engaging the thought of other philosophical traditions that he's encountering in his day. Notably, the thought of Scotus and the thought of a little bit later than Scotus, but contemporary to Scotus, Franciscan philosopher Peter Oriel. And sometimes when you're reading his treatment of Scotus, it looks like he's getting his Scotus through Oriel. Since Oriel did something very similar, and giving extensive quotations of Scotus and extensive quotations of Aquinas, and then giving his own position in Oriel's own work. But effectively, he tried to give a complete presentation of the theology of Aquinas on the model of a commentary of the sentences, and to use direct quotations from Aquinas as much as possible to give Aquinas' position, and then to try to be able to answer objections to Aquinas' position presented by other major figures of the 14th century.
I see. All right. Well, I figured maybe then we could just jump into the weeds, so to speak. How does Capreolus try to answer the rationis problem? As I understand it, he sort of breaks from the early sort of primitive Thomists who sort of posit a multiplicity of concepts, and he holds to, he does two things. One, he claims that we do have one concept, but it's one concept, and the analogates unequally participate in that concept. And then he also sort of challenges Scotus's definition of univocity.
That's right. So what we have in Capreolus is someone who's going to say to Scotus, you did it. You succeeded in showing that, at least in some sense, we have a concept of being that we're using to signify God and creatures, substance and accidents. And yet, he says to Scotus, what you did not succeed in doing was establishing that we have a concept that signifies God and creatures, substance and accidents, univocally. So he uses that distinction between the formal concept and the objective concept. And he'll say that what Scotus succeeds in showing is that we have one formal concept that can signify God and creatures, substances and accidents, but not one objective concept for God and creatures, substance, and accidents. So it effectively means it's not the case that there is some nature of being that is common to God and creatures, substance and accidents, even if we are signifying the diverse natures that they have with one concept.
I see. And as I understand it, he doesn't think that this leads to an acceptance of the univocity thesis, because he holds that the analogics can sort of perfectly or sort of imperfectly participate in our concept of being. Is that correct?
Right. So when we have univocity, then we have the formal concept is equally representing all of the things that it's signifying, and it's able to do that because they actually share in some nature. Okay, so my formal concept of human can be univocal to you and me because, well, there is something in you and me that is the same. That common nature of being human, the nature of humanity. So that formal concept has something that it will be equally represented. Now, in the case of, say, the goodness of pizza and the goodness of justice, well, you're not going to have, there's no common nature of goodness in the goodness of pizza and the goodness of justice.
Sure.
So you're not going to be able to have one formal concept equally representing both. And so likewise, in the case of substantial being and accidental being, divine being and creaturely being, there's not one concept of being that maps on. There's not one nature of being that's present in both sets of pairs. And so even if there can be one concept representing them, it can't be representing them equally.
I see.
And so that's what he's getting at when it's this understanding of unequal participation. So God and creatures are unequally being. And so my concept of being, which I get from creatures, doesn't represent divine being and creaturely being equally.
Interesting. All right, then now that we've sort of switched gears with Capreolus sort of in opposition to the primitive Thomists, how does Capreolus answer the problem of equivocation? Does he think that since we just have a singular concept unequally participated, since we're always, our words are always referring to that concept, even though that concept signifies, a diverse area of things, we don't have a problem of equivocation in our reasoning. Would you say that's fair?
Yeah, it's because I really am using one concept all through my demonstration. Okay. I don't have a four terms fallacy or fallacy of equivocation taking place.
Interesting. And then with respect to the model problem, which model does Capreolus opt for? Is he sympathetic with the healthy model? Does he embrace the principle model? What would you say is Capreolus's position?
The challenge that Capreolus gives to us here is that in his initial text where he's bringing this up, he only uses the threefold division that Aquinas has in his commentary on the sentences. And the main point he's trying to make there is that the healthy model isn't going to work because the healthy model does not involve unequal participation in a single ratio. The healthy model requires diverse rationes.
Okay.
So if we were going to apply the healthy model to God and creatures, we wouldn't actually have one formal concept that is signifying both God and creatures. We would need to have one concept for creatures and another concept for God. And so we just would end up with the fallacy of equivocation. Later on in the Defensiones, he will specifically take up the question all over again and ask about what kind of analogy applies to God and creatures. And there he will go to Aquinas's disputed questions on truth, where Aquinas will distinguish between what I'm calling healthy model of analogy and what I'm calling principal model of analogy, and Aquinas adopts principal model of analogy for talking about God and creatures. So bringing together what Capreolus says in one passage and what Capreolus says in another passage, you could say that for Capreolus, he's going to adopt the principal model of analogy. In the case of principal model of analogy, then you could say that there is a kind of unequal participation.
Okay, interesting.
In the rationes.
Interesting. All right, then. So maybe moving on from Capreolus, maybe we can sort of dive into Dominic of Flanders, Flindrensis, and his I think he was a student Soncinas. I'm sorry.
Yeah. So at the Dominican Studium at Bologna, they were very familiar with. I guess they had copies of the writings of Capreolus in the Defensiones, and you had Dominic of Flanders teaching there, and subsequent to him, Paul Soncinas teaching there, and subsequent to him, Cajetan.
Okay.
And all in close proximity of time to one another. And it is at least arguable that Cajetan would have had some studies under Soncinas, at least the last time that I checked the state of the debate, that was a position being maintained. And certainly Soncinas would have had an opportunity to be aware of the positions of Dominic of Flanders as well. So there is a kind of a lineage there at the Dominican Studium of Bologna, Cajetan going back to Soncinas, going back to Flandrensis, Dominic of Flanders, and all of them familiar with the writings of Capreolus.
I see. So Capreolus is sort of like the great grand teacher of all the school of Bologna and these thinkers.
That's right, and they also are familiar with the writings of Hervius Natalis. So you'd find both Dominic of Flanders and Paulus Soncinas quoting Hervius Natalis, including it within their discussions of analogy.
I see.
I don't find them quoting Thomas Sutton. They don't seem to be aware of his writings.
Okay, interesting. So with respect to Dominic of Flanders, or I think his nickname is Flindrensis. Is that correct? Okay. With respect to Flindrensis, when he's approaching the problem of the ratio, the rationis, is it at all similar to Capreolus's answer? Are there any differences on this point?
Well, very strong similarity of terminology.
Okay.
So he'll jump on this idea of unequal participation. Usually, when I read from Flindrensis, I find him writing diverse participation rather than specifically unequal participation.
Okay.
But it's not clear to me that that's anything more than a verbal difference.
Okay.
Now, something that Flindrensis highlights is that really all that are different concepts of being that we have involve diverse participation in one of our concepts of being, and that is our concept of substantial being. So he really emphasizes the primacy of our concept of substantial being. So your concept of quantitative being is your concept of substantial being unequally participating.
Interesting. Okay. So just like with how in things accidents are parasitic on substances for their being, so too our concept of quantity or relation or action and passion, they're dependent upon our concept of substantial being.
Yeah, good. Yeah, that's a good way of talking about it. Yeah.
Interesting.
So there's a parallel between the I guess you could say the metaphysical nature of being and the order dependency there.
Okay.
In our concepts.
Okay. Okay, interesting. And how would this concept of substantial being applied to God and creatures?
So presumably it's our concept of substantial being that's the concept of creatures that we're working with.
Okay.
When we're thinking about God. And so you could also then say that our concept of substantial being is diversely participated by substantial being and divine being.
Interesting.
Okay.
Okay.
So presumably more perfectly participated in by creaturely being. But there is something that we know that is beyond and more perfect than this creaturely being, that our concept of, that we use our concepts of substantial being to think about, but we think about it inadequately.
Okay. Interesting.
Because it is something that is greater than or different than
sure
the being that we arrive at through our encounter with creatures.
Sure. And then how does his understanding of the ratio rationis problem of a concept that's diversely participated, how does he how does he square that with the model problem? Does he adopt any clear preference for the principal model or healthy model?
When he takes up the question of the different models, he will end up adopting, at least for the case of God and creatures, the principal model of analogy. And he goes right to Aquinas's disputed questions on truth. Question 2, Article 11. And says that when we're dealing with the case of God and creatures, that we should not be using the healthy model to understand the analogy between God and creatures, but the principle or sight, depending on which example from Aristotle you're using as your point of departure, to think about God and creatures analogy.
Interesting. And as I understand it, following on that model of principal analogy, Flindrensis attempts to answer the equivocation problem by a distinction of the analogates sort of per prius and per posterior, sort of like there's a prior and posterior. Is that correct?
Yeah, I don't find Flandrensis actually linking together his solution to the models of analogy problem to his solution to the equivocation problem.
Okay.
Primarily what he does is just to give an extended quotation of Hervius Natalis' answer to the question, and then add as his gloss, well, it's because it applies per prius to one and per posterius to the other, or with primary primacy to one and secondarily to the other, and that's supposed to be sufficient to preserve analogy. But once again, what do the medieval logic textbooks say?
Right.
The second mode of the fallacy of equivocation is when you have the fallacy of equivocation due to a term being used in a primary sense and in a secondary sense.
Right.
In the same argument.
Right. All right. And then okay, so the what would you say is the biggest difference between Capreolus's understanding of analogy and Flandrensis? Do they follow pretty closely on these sort of disputed topics, or is there any sort of development beyond Capreolus in Flandrensis?
Well, one of the differences is that Flandrensis doesn't, in the context of these disputes, make a distinction between the formal concept and the objective concept. So you could say that there's a level of distinction that Flandrensis doesn't draw into his remarks. Another difference is that Flandrensis is much clearer that it is just this one ratio, and it is the ratio of substantial being that we're using all the way through here. Some figures, including some scholastic figures, thought that according to Capreolus, this concept of being that you're using is your formal concept that's signifying God and creatures is a separate concept from either your concept of creaturely being or your concept of divine being. Okay. As though a kind of abstraction from both. Now, I have argued, and based off of my reading of Capreolus, that he's actually closer to Flandrensis on this point. But that's a disputed question in the Capreolus studies. Sure. You could say. Soncinas does hold that position, though. Right. So transitioning over to Soncinas. Soncinas does think that your concept of being that applies to God and creatures is not really your concept of creaturely being imperfectly signifying God while perfectly signifying creatures.
Okay.
Actually is a different concept from both of them, or your concept signifying accidental being isn't really your concept of substantial being imperfectly signifying accidental being. It's a different concept from substantial being and a different concept from any of the accidental modes of being altogether, abstracting from all of them together.
So we form like a sort of like a being of reason that's distinct from all these other concepts, and it's through this separate concept that we're able to sort of preserve demonstration.
That unifies. No, that you could say is a principle of unity for all of these different concepts.
Okay.
Through their, I guess you could say, or that Soncinas would say, analogously relate to, I guess you could say, our super concept of being.
So still trying to understand. So we've got one separate ratio and a multiplicity of ratio that correspond to sorts of things out there. Is that correct? Or
sure. So there is a concept of substantial being, and there is a concept of quantitative being, and a concept of qualitative being, and there's a concept that's just being, without being the concept of substantial being, without being the concept of qualitative being, without being the concept of quantitative being. And that is something that sets Soncinas apart from Dominic of Flanders. Says, no, there's a concept of substantial being, but your concept of substantial being also, in diverse ways, is signifying the accidental modes of being and divine being.
Interesting. So how is this any different than Scotus's understanding of?
Well, it seems to be a movement towards Scotus's position. Yeah.
Okay.
So you could say that Soncinas is granting even more to Scotus than those other figures.
All right. And then with respect to the model that Soncinas adopts, if I remember from my readings, he isn't as clear on this point of which model he prefers. I don't think that he is taken with the healthy model, but I don't know if he ever explicitly endorses the principal model. Is that correct?
Well, if you can find him explicitly endorsing the principal model, please send me the text. I would appreciate that. The main thing that he does in the passages that get cited in the literature on Soncinas or medieval discussions of analogy, he pretty much just steals the line from Capreolus, and he's explicit that he's doing this. It's he's saying that this is what Capreolus says, and he quotes him almost verbatim, with the difference being that he's clear that he's using his own understanding of the concept as being a separate concept of being, whereas I argue that Capreolus doesn't regard this concept of being that applies to God and creatures as a distinct concept in its own right from the concept of creaturely being. Okay.
And then with this understanding of separate ratio and all the objective ratio, how does Soncinas answer the equivocation problem? As I understand it, it's very similar to how Capreolus will answer this. Is that correct? Or
yep, and it's even easier for Soncinas because it's a separate concept from the concept of substantial being and the concept of accidental being. You got a separate concept of being as it applies to God and to creatures, and you just plug that concept that applies that applies to both, but not univocally.
Okay.
And you avoid the fallacy of equivocation.